The blood that gushed from her mouth stained the white silks of the royal bed like withered rose petals, and in that moment, January 5th, 1589, the woman who had once commanded kings and shaped the destiny of France was nothing more than a body. Twisted by pain, her glassy eyes fixed on the vaulted ceiling of Blois, while death slowly drained the last trace of power from her veins. Catherine de' Medici, the Queen Mother, the Florentine serpent, the woman who had survived conspiracies, religious wars, and the deaths of 4 children, now wasted away in agony, each breath a rasp echoing through the castle's frozen chambers, like the final sigh of an era dying with her. Just 2 years earlier, in 1587, Catherine still walked the corridors of the Louvre with the haughtiness of one who knew that every word she spoke could ignite or pacify France. At 68 years old, her plump figure draped in black brocades moved with the determination of a woman who had turned widowhood into absolute power. Her small dark eyes, described by Venetian ambassadors as daggers of ice, scrutinized every face at court, every gesture, every whisper that could betray treason. She knew everyone's secrets, that the Duke of Guise corresponded in secret with Philip II of Spain, that Henry of Navarre seduced the ladies of the court to extract political information, that her own son, King Henry III, wept in secret in his royal chambers, tormented by the pressure of ruling a kingdom on the brink of collapse. Catherine knew because she herself had woven that web of espionage, bribery, and blackmail that held France together by invisible, steel-strong threads. Power had come to her through tragedy, like almost everything in her life. When Henry II died in 1559, pierced by a lance during a tournament, Catherine smelled her husband's metallic blood soaking her garments as she held him in her arms. But she also sensed something else, the heady fragrance of authority that at last belonged to her. She had been a consort queen ignored and humiliated by Henry's official mistress, Diane de Poitiers, forced to smile politely while another woman wore the crown jewels and dictated court fashions. But when the king died, Catherine did not mourn, for long. 3 days after the funeral, she had already expelled Diane de Poitiers from power, confiscated her lands, and begun consolidating her position as regent for her minor sons. The first act of her true political life was to order that all the love letters Henry had written to Diane be burned in the public square. As she watched from the Louvre windows, a cold smile curving her full lips. For nearly 30 years, Catherine ruled France through her children. First Francis II, who died at 16 after only a year on the throne. Then Charles IX, whom she manipulated like a puppet until his premature death. And finally Henry III, the son she loved most, who would become her greatest source of torment. Each transition of power was orchestrated by her with the precision of a clockmaker and the cruelty of an executioner. When Francis II died, supposedly of an ear infection, the court physicians whispered that the timing was too convenient, coming just as the Guises were consolidating their power through the young Queen Mary, Queen of Scots. When Charles IX lay agonizing on his deathbed, delirious about rivers of blood and begging forgiveness for the massacres of Huguenots, he had ordered. Catherine stayed at his side, holding his trembling hand as she murmured words of comfort, but her eyes remained dry, already calculating the next political moves necessary to keep the Valois dynasty on the throne. Henry III's accession to the throne in 1574 should have been the apex of her power, but it marked the beginning of her slow agony. Henry was intelligent, cultured, sensitive to the arts and poetry, but he was also weak, indecisive, and tormented by a sexuality that the court whispered was against nature. Catherine had reared a king who loved her devotedly, but could not rule without her, and that would become the source of her own destruction. While she had learned to navigate the turbulent waters of French politics with the cunning of a serpent, Henry sank into bouts of melancholy, surrounded himself with effeminate favorites who scandalized the nobility and shirked his royal duties in religious pilgrimages or in orgies that lasted for days. Meanwhile, France bled in religious wars that seemed endless, with Catholics and Huguenots massacring each other as the royal treasury emptied and monarchical authority dissolved like sugar in rain. It was during the 1580s that Catherine began to feel the first signs that her body, like her power, was disintegrating. Excruciating stomach pains awoke her in the dead of night, and she found herself bent over silver basins, vomiting greenish bile that stained her linen shifts. The court physicians, with their white beards and solemn gazes, spoke of imbalanced humors and prescribed bloodlettings that only left her weaker. But Catherine knew it was not just her humors that were unbalanced. It was the entire structure she had built over decades that was crumbling. Henry III, more and more unstable, began making decisions without consulting her, influenced by his favorites and by a growing paranoia that made him see enemies in every shadow. The Duke of Guise, Henry of Guise, had grown too powerful, controlling Paris and much of the army, and it was whispered that he planned to depose the Valois and seize the throne for himself. The scent of conspiracy permeated the air of the Louvre like poisonous incense. Catherine, who had been mistress of intrigue, now found herself surrounded by plots she could no longer control. Her former allies, the ladies of the court she had, corrupted or blackmailed for years, began to avoid her gaze, and foreign ambassadors, who once vied for an audience with her, now addressed themselves directly to Henry III or to the Guises. At banquets, she studied the faces around the oval table, recognizing in each expression the cold calculation of those who already deemed her politically dead. Her spies, once her eyes and ears throughout France, began selling information to other masters, and Catherine discovered that she was being betrayed by people she had considered completely loyal. The final humiliation came in May 1588, during the Day of the Barricades, when Henry, Duke of Guise, marched into Paris against the express orders of the king and was greeted as a hero by the Catholic populace. Catherine, who had spent her life preventing the French capital from falling into any faction's hands, saw her decades-long work collapse in a single morning. The people raised barricades in the streets, shouting, "Long live Guise!" While Henry III fled Paris like a coward, and she was forced to accompany him, her litter swaying along the rutted roads as tears of rage and despair ran down her flaccid cheeks. During that humiliating journey to Chartres, she tasted for the first time the bitter flavor of defeat, a metallic tang that mixed with the blood that began to rise regularly to her throat. France, which she had ruled with an iron fist, now rejected her like a toothless crone, and she knew she would never regain the authority she had lost. The months that followed were a dizzying descent into hell. Catherine, who had always been a woman of voracious appetite, began losing weight at an alarming rate. Her clothes, once too tight for her plump body, now hung loosely on her bony shoulders. Her face, once round and rosy despite her age, became cadaverous, with pronounced cheekbones and sunken eyes set in dark sockets. The ladies who dressed her each morning whispered about the strange blotches appearing on her skin, small subcutaneous hemorrhages that formed a purple map of her physical deterioration. But it was her mind that tormented her most. Catherine, who had been able to keep dozens of intrigues spinning in her head, now found herself confused, forgetting the names of people she had known for decades, losing the thread of important conversations. During royal councils, she sometimes looked around the table without fully recognizing where she was, and she had to develop the skill of masking her confusion with calculated silences that others interpreted as astuteness. The last straw came in December 1588, when Henry III finally decided to act against the Guises. Catherine, who had preached political moderation and balance between factions her entire life, watched with growing horror as preparations for the assassination of the Duke of Guise advanced. She knew that killing Henry of Guise would be a catastrophic mistake, one that would turn the Duke into a martyr and give Catholic extremists a saint to venerate. She implored her son to reconsider, kneeling before him in his private chambers, her trembling hands clutching the royal robes as tears of despair streamed down her face. "My son," she murmured in a voice no more than a hoarse whisper, "this death will condemn us all. Guise's blood will stain the Valois throne forever." But Henry III, for the first time in his life, did not heed his mother's advice. His eyes, always seeking approval in Catherine's face, now shone with a feverish determination she did not recognize. On the morning of December 23rd, 1588, when the assassin's daggers found Henry of Guise in the council chamber at Blois, Catherine was in her apartments, but the sound of screams, furniture being overturned, footsteps thundering through the corridors, reached her with the clarity of a nightmare. She knew immediately that her son had committed the fatal error of his dynasty. When Henry III came to her, still with blood on his hands, seeking approval or at least understanding, Catherine looked at him with an expression he would never forget. There was no love in that gaze, no pride, not even anger. There was only a deep ancestral sorrow, as if she was seeing not only the end of a life, but the end of an entire lineage. "You cut too well," she said in a cold voice. "Now we shall see if you can sew the pieces back together." In the days that followed the assassination, as the news spread through France like wildfire, Catherine witnessed the final collapse of everything she had fought for. Paris rose in revolt. Catholic preachers declared Henry III a tyrannical regicide, and Pope Sixtus V, who had once been her ally, threatened to excommunicate the entire royal family. But what terrified her most was what was happening inside her own body. The blood she had begun to cough up sporadically now spurted from her mouth several times a day, staining her linen handkerchiefs with a dark red that reeked of iron and decay. Her entrails felt as though they were dissolving, and she experienced the sensation of acid eating away at her internal organs. The physicians, increasingly alarmed, spoke of internal putrefaction and corruption of the humors. But Catherine knew that what was killing her was not an ordinary disease. It was France itself decomposing within her, as if the very kingdom she had ruled for so long were being regurgitated by her body in spasms of blood and bile. Nights became a hell of pain and delirium. Catherine, who once slept soundly, now spent hours awake, haunted by visions more real than reality itself. She saw the dead of her political life parading through her apartments. Francis of Guise, murdered in 1563, pointed at her with a bloodied finger. Gaspard de Coligny, killed during the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, whispered accusations. In her ear, even Diane de Poitiers, who had died years before, appeared to her with a cruel smile, wearing the crown Catherine had taken from her. But the most terrifying visions were those of her own dead children. Francis II, Charles IX, and little Hercule, who had died in childhood, came to her bedside on the coldest nights, their faces pale as wax, their accusing eyes fixed on her face. "Mother," they whispered in unison, "why did you sacrifice us for power? Why did you teach us to hate when you should have taught us to love?" By day, Catherine still tried to keep up appearances. She dressed with the help of her ladies, applied white powders to disguise the cadaverous paleness of her face, and received visitors in her private salon. But anyone who saw her in those last days of December 1588 and early January 1589 was shocked by her transformation. Margaret of Valois, her daughter who had returned to court after years in exile, later wrote in her memoirs, "My mother had become a shadow of herself. Her voice, which once commanded kings, was now but a hoarse whisper. Her eyes, which could read men's souls, now wandered aimlessly, as though seeing things we could not see. But the most terrible thing was the smell, a sweet, nauseating odor of decay that no perfume could mask emanated from her body, as though she were already half dead. Pierre de l'Estoile, the famous Parisian chronicler, recorded in his diary the rumors circulating about Catherine's condition. They say the Queen Mother vomits blood every day, and that in her deliriums she confesses terrible crimes. Some whisper that she was poisoned by agents of the Guises, others that she was cursed by some Huguenot witch. But the wisest say she is being devoured from within by all the sins she committed in the name of raison d'etat. They say she calls for the dead at night, begging forgiveness from voices only she can hear. The truth was even more terrible than the rumors. Catherine was dying of a combination of cancer, probably stomach cancer, and what the physicians of the time called black melancholy, a deep depression that seemed literally to consume her body. But she was also dying of something more subtle and devastating, the awareness that she had utterly failed in her life's mission. She had devoted 3 decades to keeping the Valois on the French throne, and now saw that it had all been in vain. Henry III had no children, and when he died, the crown would pass to Henry of Navarre, the Protestant leader she had fought against throughout her political career. Everything she had struggled for, every crime she had committed, every alliance she had forged and broken, all of it proved utterly useless. She had sacrificed her soul to maintain a dynasty destined to die with her. The year 1589 began with a dreadful omen. On the morning of January 1st, when Catherine tried to rise from her bed, she collapsed onto the cold marble floor, and the blood that gushed from her mouth was so abundant that it formed a red pool around her head. Her ladies rushed to her aid, but when they lifted her, she was unconscious, and her breathing was so faint they feared she was already dead. When she finally regained consciousness a few hours later, the first thing Catherine saw was the painted ceiling of her apartments, where golden angels seemed to mock her with their eternal smiles. "God has abandoned me," she murmured, and those were the last coherent words many of her courtiers heard her speak. The days that followed were prolonged agony. Catherine alternated between periods of unconsciousness and terrifying moments of lucidity, during which she seemed fully aware of the extent of her ruin. She could no longer keep food in her stomach, vomiting anything she tried to swallow, including water. Her body, which had been her instrument of power for decades, now betrayed her completely. Her intestines contracted in painful spasms that made her writhe in bed like one possessed. Her skin turned a yellowish, almost greenish hue, and became so thin that veins showed through like blue rivers on a map of suffering. Her hands, once the grip on the reins of European power, shook uncontrollably, and her fingernails grew excessively because she had no strength to clip them. But perhaps the most horrifying aspect of her agony was the transformation of her voice. Catherine, once an eloquent speaker capable of persuading ambassadors and intimidating nobles with her words, now could only produce guttural sounds, as though her throat were filled with stones. When she tried to speak, what came out was a mixture of moans, grunts, and occasionally disconnected words in Italian, French, and Latin. Those who managed to decipher her murmurs reported that she constantly repeated names. "Henry, my Henry, forgive me. Francis, Charles, all dead, all my fault." Henry III, who despite all his weaknesses genuinely loved his mother, spent hours at her bedside, holding her cold hand and trying to comfort her. But even he was haunted by what he saw. In letters to confidants, he described Catherine's last days as a descent into hell while still alive. He wrote, "My mother, who was always my rock, my counselor, my strength, is now but a grotesque shadow of what she was. She sometimes looks at me as if she does not recognize me, and other times as if she sees me for the first time and is horrified by what she sees. I know she blames me for everything, for Guise's murder, for our house's ruin, for the civil war tearing France apart, and she is right. I destroyed in one day what she built in decades. On the night of January 4th, 1589, Catherine entered her final agony. The court chronicler, who had access to the accounts of the ladies present, described a scene as though from Dante's Inferno. The Queen Mother writhed in her bed as if invisible demons tortured her. Her eyes rolled back, showing only the whites, and from her mouth shot a dark fluid that stained the silk sheets. She screamed names of people long dead, as though they stood in the room with her. At times, she extended her arms toward the air, as if trying to grasp something no one else could see. The odor emanating from her body was so strong that some ladies had to leave the chamber lest they vomit. Father Edmund Auger, her confessor, tried to administer the last rites, but Catherine, in one of her final moments of lucidity, pushed him away with surprising strength. "No!" she screamed in a voice that no longer seemed human. "God does not want me. I sold my soul for my children, for France. There is no forgiveness. No." Her words dissolved into a gurgle of blood that flowed from her chin, staining the white linen pillow. When the moment of her death finally arrived, around 2 o'clock in the morning on January 5th, Catherine de' Medici did not die in peace. According to witnesses, she rose partially in bed with a supernatural effort, her eyes bulging as if she were seeing something terrible, and from her mouth gushed so much blood that it completely soaked the sheets. "No!" she screamed one last time, her voice echoing through the castle's stone corridors. And then she collapsed, her head striking the headboard with a dull thud that made everyone present tremble. The blood continued to drip from her mouth for several minutes after. She ceased breathing, as though her body were expelling every last drop of life. Henry III, who had rushed to the room upon hearing the screams, found his mother with her eyes open and fixed on the ceiling, an expression of eternal terror frozen on her face. He tried to close her eyelids, but they refused to stay shut. As if even in death Catherine continued seeing horrors the living could not imagine. The king knelt beside the bed for hours, holding his mother's already cold hand, sobbing like a lost child. "Mother," he repeated, "Mother, what will I do without you? How will I govern without you? You have left me alone with all the enemies we created together." News of Catherine de' Medici's death spread through France with the swiftness of a plague. In Paris, controlled by extremist Catholics, there were celebrations in the streets. Fireworks were launched. Church bells rang out in festive peals, and commoners burned effigies of the Florentine serpent in the public squares. Catholic preachers declared that God had finally punished the woman who had sold France to the heretics. But in other parts of the kingdom, particularly among moderate politicians who had benefited from her diplomatic maneuverings, there was a sense of emptiness, as if an entire era had come to an end. The Venetian ambassador wrote to the Doge, "With Catherine de' Medici's death, France has lost its last true politician. What comes now will be nothing but barbarism and fanaticism." Catherine's funeral was a hastily arranged, almost clandestine ceremony. Henry III, fearing that his presence in Paris would provoke further turmoil, decided to bury his mother in Saint-Denis with little pomp. The funeral procession, which should have been majestic for a woman who had governed France for 3 decades, consisted of only a few carriages escorted by nervous soldiers. When the cortege passed through the streets of Paris, instead of lamentations and respect, it was met with cries of "Death to the Italian" and "Witch, witch." Stones were hurled at the coffin, and only military protection prevented the body from being desecrated by the crowd. Even after her death, Catherine continued to be haunted by sinister rumors and legends. Some claimed she had been seen wandering the corridors of Blois, searching for her dead children. Others whispered that she had made a pact with the devil, and that her soul was condemned to roam the earth until the Valois line was completely extinguished. Some chroniclers reported that at the moment of her death, every clock in the castle of Blois stopped simultaneously, and a terrible storm swept the region, as though nature itself were reacting to the departure of a force that had shaped France for so long. But perhaps the most chilling testimony about Catherine's final moments came from her own daughter, Margaret of Valois. Years later, in her memoirs, she wrote, "My mother did not die like a Christian. She died like an ancient pagan, refusing the sacraments, spitting blood and curses in equal measure. In the weeks before her death, she said something to me I have never forgotten. Daughter, I sold my soul to keep you on the throne, but I discovered that the devil does not keep bargains. He took my soul, but he did not protect my children. Beware of power, for it is a jealous lover that destroys all it touches." When she died, I felt that it was not merely a woman departing, but an entire era of our history closing forever. Catherine de' Medici's legacy would become one of the most controversial in French history. She had been simultaneously one of the most powerful women of her time and one of the most hated. Her methods, espionage, blackmail, political assassinations, religious manipulation, became the standard of European politics, but they also created a cycle of violence that culminated in her own son's assassination just months after her death. She had fought tirelessly to preserve France's unity, yet her tactics paradoxically deepened the divisions that led to the bloodiest civil war in French history. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of her story was the utter loneliness in which she died. Catherine, who had spent her entire life surrounded by courtiers, spies, ambassadors, and suitors, died essentially alone, abandoned by all except her weakest son. She had sacrificed everything: love, family, faith, friendship, on the altar of political power, only to discover in the end that power is a cold companion at the moment of death. Letters she wrote in her final months, discovered decades later in secret archives, reveal a woman tormented by the awareness that she had lost her humanity in the process of becoming a historical force. In one of those letters, addressed to no one in particular and apparently never sent, Catherine wrote, "I became a monster to protect those I loved, but in the process, I became incapable of love. I learned every secret of power, yet I forgot the secret of happiness. I mastered kings and popes, but I never mastered my own heart. Now, on the eve of my death, I realize that a life without love is a wasted life, no matter how many thrones you conquered or how many enemies you defeated. I die as I lived, alone, feared but not loved. May God have mercy on my soul, for I no longer have." The France Catherine left behind was a wounded, divided, and exhausted kingdom. The religious wars she had tried to control with her Byzantine intrigues would continue for another decade, claiming hundreds of thousands of lives. Her son Henry III would be assassinated in August 1589, fulfilling the prophecy she had uttered. Upon seeing a bloody dagger in her hands, the Valois dynasty, for which she had fought so fiercely, would die with him, and the throne would pass to Henry of Navarre, the Huguenot who would become Henry IV and found the Bourbon dynasty. Ironically, it would be this Protestant king who would finally bring peace to France by converting to Catholicism and promulgating the Edict of Nantes, which guaranteed religious tolerance, exactly the kind of moderate solution Catherine had. sought to implement for decades, only to be sabotaged by extremists on both sides. In the centuries that followed, historians would debate Catherine de' Medici's legacy incessantly. Some would view her as a brilliant politician who saved France from disintegration, others as a Machiavellian figure who poisoned French politics with her intrigues. But perhaps the truth is darker and more human. She was a woman who loved power too much and discovered too late that power does not love anyone in return. The final irony of her story lies in the fact that Catherine, who dedicated her life to preventing France from fracturing into civil war, died precisely as that fragmentation became inevitable. Her last conscious words, recorded by her lady-in-waiting, were a question that would echo through the corridors of history. Was it worth it? She asked this while gazing at a portrait of her dead children, and no one dared answer. The question hung in the air like the scent of incense in an empty church, and perhaps that is Catherine de' Medici's true legacy, not the intrigues she orchestrated or the thrones she preserved, but the eternal question about the price of power and the limits of human ambition. When the sun rose over Blois on the morning of January 5th, 1589, illuminating a castle still reeking of blood and death, France awoke orphaned of its queen mother. Catherine de' Medici had departed, taking with her the secrets of 3 decades of European politics, but leaving behind a dreadful lesson etched in every drop of blood she had spat out. Absolute power corrupts absolutely, and even those who believe they serve the greater good may find themselves, at the end, serving only their own demons. Her death was not just the end of a life, but the end of an era, and the beginning of a France that would have to learn, through more decades of blood and tears, that a nation's true greatness lies not in its ruler's cunning, but in its people's ability to find, even amid chaos, reasons to continue believing in the possibility of a better future. The serpent had died, but the poison she spread would circulate through France's veins for generations. A timeless reminder that some victories cost the soul of the victor, and that death, when it comes for those who lived only for power, brings no peace, only the bitter echo of a question without an answer. Was it worth it?